You have done this before. Explained something you did to a partner, a boss, yourself, at 2 in the morning, and watched the explanation hold. The other person nodded. The account closed. And somewhere underneath the closing, something did not agree to the terms. There's a specific mechanic worth naming here because it's easy to miss. The more times you tell a story about yourself, the smoother it gets, not through dishonesty, necessarily, but through repetition. Details that don't serve the account fall away. Framing that makes the account easier to deliver gets reinforced each time it's used. Retelling can quietly reshape what's remembered, sanding down an account until it fits comfortably in the mouth. None of that requires bad faith. It only requires enough repetition, which means self-explanation isn't neutral, performed on top of an untouched memory. It can change what you sincerely believe happened, not just what you're willing to say, making the question of what actually happened harder to settle from the inside, not easier. Explanations work on other people for a specific reason. Other people don't have full access to what actually happened. They only have your account of it, delivered with enough coherence and enough confidence to be believed. Persuasion is a kind of social technology, built for an audience that wasn't there when the thing itself occurred. This holds even when the explanation is sincerely believed by the person giving it. Sincerity closes the gap between speaker and listener, not necessarily the gap between an account and what actually happened. The private audience isn't in the same position, but it isn't an all-seeing one either. It doesn't hold a perfect recording of the event, only a messier kind of access. Fragments of memory the explanation had to leave out, the consequences that actually followed, private values the explanation didn't need to satisfy, and physical or emotional reactions that don't always cooperate with a tidy account. That's a fallible kind of access, nothing like the ancient image we're about to look at, but it's still access the external listener never had. That asymmetry is what gives the private reception of an explanation a different texture than the public one. Even a flawless account, one that genuinely satisfies everyone who hears it, can leave something unsettled, not because some perfect hidden record contradicts it, but because the fuller, messier material behind it was never fully addressed. Something close to that asymmetry between what can be argued and what apparently cannot sits at the center of a vividly preserved ancient Egyptian image of judgment after death, one that developed across centuries of funerary practice and that later came to be summarized informally under the modern label Book of the Dead. That title is not ancient, and it does not name one fixed book. It describes a variable body of spells and images compiled differently from tomb to tomb and papyrus to papyrus, assembled for specific individuals rather than issued as a single, uniform scripture. The judgment scene at the center of this video, a heart, a scale, a feather, did not appear complete and fixed at one moment. It developed, was copied, adjusted, and re-illustrated across centuries with real variation in wording and imagery depending on the source. This wasn't a static tradition inherited whole from some founding moment. It was built up over an extremely long span of Egyptian history, texts and images accumulating, shifting, and consolidating as funerary practice itself changed. What we're describing then isn't what the Egyptians believed in some single, timeless sense. It's closer to a recurring, evolving answer that different generations kept returning to and refining. What stayed consistent enough to matter is what the heart, the ib, was believed to be. Not simply an organ that pumped blood, and not simply a seat of emotion set against some separate seat of reason. The Egyptians didn't carve the self along that modern line. The heart was understood to hold intellect, memory, intention, and character together, the place where a person's actual conduct was, in effect, recorded as it happened. That's the myth's premise worth flagging early, an internal witness recording without distortion, without gaps, without the editing, an actual human memory performs on itself constantly. Nothing about human memory or conscience works that cleanly, the gap this video keeps circling back to. In many forms of Egyptian mummification, the heart was deliberately left within the body, treated as something the deceased needed to carry forward rather than something to discard. A small amulet, often carved in the shape of a scarab and known now as a heart scarab, was frequently placed over or near the heart in burial. It's most closely associated with a particular funerary spell, and its purpose, broadly, was protective, meant to help the deceased pass safely through judgment. On the other side of the scale that judgment eventually reached sat something even harder to translate than the heart. Maat gets flattened, casually, into goodness, and that flattening loses almost everything that made the concept powerful. Maat was closer to truth, right order, proportion and balance, cosmic and social at once, the principle that was supposed to keep the world coherent, the flood arriving, the sun rising, human relationships holding their shape. To be measured against Maat wasn't to be graded against a list of virtues. It was to be tested for whether a life had actually stayed in proportion with how things were meant to hold together, or had, in some way, quietly distorted that order. In the texts that describe it, living in Maat could touch everything from how a person treated the vulnerable to whether their word could be relied on in ordinary dealings. It wasn't confined to a private, interior virtue. It was supposed to be visible in how a life actually moved through the world. Among the spells associated with the heart scarab is one now catalogued as Spell 30B, addressed directly to the heart itself, asking it not to stand up in opposition, not to create testimony against its owner in the hall of judgment. It's tempting to read that as proof the dead secretly believed themselves guilty, pleading with their own conscience to stay quiet. That reading claims more than the evidence actually supports. The spell treats the heart as a potentially adverse witness. That does not prove hidden guilt. It does reveal that acquittal was not imagined as something speech alone could safely guarantee. Fear of an unfavorable verdict, ritual caution, and a kind of magical insurance policy are all plausible, non-exclusive motives. What the spell tells us at minimum is that the heart was not trusted by default to simply agree with its owner's account of themselves. It would also be too simple to call the spell a cheat code. In this religious world, spoken and inscribed words were part of the process itself, and the surviving material does not let us reduce the judgment to either conduct alone or formula alone. What it does show is that ritual protection mattered enormously, and that the deceased did not treat the verdict as fully under their control. The same funerary tradition also preserved a very different kind of defense, a long declaration catalogued as Spell 125, in which the deceased addressed a tribunal of divine assessors, conventionally numbered at 42, though surviving manuscripts vary in number, sequence, and the alignment between assessors and denied acts. The declarations repeat a relentless pattern of denial, claims to the effect that the deceased had not stolen, lied, or caused harm, each directed to a particular assessor. What that structure shows is that wrongdoing wasn't approached as a single moral score. It was addressed act by act, named one at a time, itemized. The exact relationship between this declaration, the heart scarab spell, and the physical weighing which came first, how directly one reinforced the other, isn't something the surviving sources fix into one clean sequence, and manuscripts vary in how they arrange and illustrate the material. What can be said is that both belong to the same judgment complex, a vision of the afterlife that asked the dead to speak on their own behalf, and separately weighed something that didn't require speech to render its verdict. To modern eyes, the declarations sound almost like testimony, while the weighed heart looks almost like evidence, a comparison worth naming carefully. because it's an anachronism, a way of making the image legible to us, not a distinction the Egyptians themselves would have recognized. Egyptian ritual speech carried real religious and magical weight in its own right. It was never imagined as empty argument. The scene that gives this broader judgment complex its most recognizable image is the one that survives most vividly in tomb paintings and illustrated papyri. In many of the best-known versions, Anubis attends the scale, the heart on one side, a feather, or an image standing for Maat on the other. Thoth records the result, and Osiris presides. The exact arrangement and cast vary across manuscripts. It's tempting, looking at that image now, to read it as a machine, an automatic mechanism with no room left for persuasion, an outcome simply read off a needle. That reading is a modern, dramatic simplification of a scene the Egyptians understood as inhabited by will and divine judgment, not a coldly automatic process. The distinction matters more than it might first seem to. A machine has no perspective on what it measures, it simply returns a result. A tribunal, even one whose verdict rests on an already weighed object, still implies attention and judgment brought to bear on that result. The gods in this scene aren't spectators to an automatic process. They're participants in a judgment that happens to include a physical weighing as one of its elements, not the whole of it. If the heart weighed heavier than the feather, it was understood to be given to Ammit, a composite creature, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, waiting at the base of the scale. And what that consumption meant was not eternal torment in the later Christian sense. The safest description is exclusion from successful continuation in the afterlife. The surviving material does not require us to reduce every version to one single mechanism of punishment. Whether that outcome should be understood, in a more contemporary register, as something like psychological incoherence, a person whose account of themselves has stopped holding together, is an interpretation this video is making, not a claim about literal Egyptian doctrine. It's worth being honest about where the description ends and the reading begins. The scene changed as it was copied, gaining detail, shifting scale, and redistributing figures. What persisted was its central tension, the heart measured against Maat, with the failed outcome waiting nearby. Most of what survives from this tradition comes from funerary texts written to help a specific person pass, inscribed in tombs, painted on coffins, copied onto papyrus, and buried with the body precisely because passing was the hoped-for outcome, not a statistic being reported. It would be a mistake to read these documents and conclude that Egyptians believed most people failed or that most people were expected to succeed. The texts simply aren't built to answer that question either way. What they do offer is something else, not only a threat held over the dead, but an image of the order a person hoped their life could actually survive being measured against, a scene built, at least in intention, around passage, not condemnation. Everything so far has stayed as close as the sources allowed to what this tradition actually pictured. What follows is a different kind of claim, not a historical one, but a psychological one built by drawing a comparison between an ancient image and a modern experience. It's worth marking that shift plainly because the two are easy to blur, and blurring them is exactly the kind of move worth avoiding. Because something in that ancient image still resembles what happens at 2 in the morning, when an explanation that worked on everyone else quietly fails to work on you. Part of why the explanation and the internal weighing can diverge so sharply is that they're answering different questions. When you explain yourself to someone else, you're usually answering a social question. Can this relationship continue? Will I still be trusted? Does this cost me something I can't afford to lose? That's a real question worth a real answer. But it isn't the same question the private ledger seems to be asking, which has less to do with continuation and more to do with correspondence, whether the account matches what actually happened, independent of whether anyone else is satisfied by it. Being believed answers the first question. It doesn't touch the second. And it's easy, in the relief of being believed, to mistake one answer for the other. Not all of that internal weight is the same kind of thing, though, and it's worth separating out what it might actually be. Some of it is accurate moral recognition, a correct registering that you did cause harm, break trust, or fall short of something you actually value. That kind of weight is information. It corresponds to something real. Some of it is imposed guilt, carried not because your own sense of balance objects, but because someone else's judgment, a family's expectations, a culture's rules told you it should weigh something. That can feel identical to the first kind without being the same kind of evidence. And some of it is excessive guilt that has outgrown whatever it was responding to, refusing to lift even once any proportional debt has clearly been paid. A scale stuck, reading the same number, no matter what's placed on it. There's a reason imposed guilt is so easy to mistake for the accurate kind. Both arrive with the same physical signature, the same tightness, the same replaying, the same reluctance to look directly at the memory. The feeling doesn't come labeled, and there's no reliable shortcut for sorting one from another. These are patterns worth examining, not a diagnostic test. It would be convenient if accuracy always moved with new information, while imposition always stayed fixed. Neither holds as a rule. Accurate moral recognition can remain rigid for good reason when nothing about the harm has actually changed. Imposed guilt can shift quietly once its source loses authority over you, without that shift proving it was ever accurate. Excessive guilt can attach to something entirely real and then simply refuse to recalibrate no matter what changes afterward. Whether the weight moves is one clue among several, not a verdict on its own. Sorting out what's actually owed usually takes more than the feeling itself, the facts, the consequences that followed, the context, and where possible, the perspective of whoever was actually affected. Here, the myth's usefulness runs out, and it's worth saying so directly, because feeling guilty does not prove guilt. People carry shame for harm they didn't actually cause, inherited responsibility, misplaced blame, a conscience calibrated by someone else's standards rather than their own conduct. And the reverse is just as true. People can cause real, lasting harm and feel almost nothing, an absence of inner weight that says more about the limits of their attention than about their innocence. Human guilt is not an infallible internal scale. It can be wrong in both directions, too heavy for what actually happened, or silent when it shouldn't be. The Egyptian image offers something we don't actually have, a judgment that weighs the true record without distortion, without the false positives and false negatives an ordinary conscience is capable of producing. That is precisely what makes it a myth and not a diagnostic tool to be trusted simply because it's what you happen to feel. What accurate moral recognition tends to ask for, when it shows up honestly, usually isn't an explanation at all. It's acknowledgement, actually naming what happened without the framing that makes it easier to live with. That naming has to happen somewhere the framing can't reach it, which usually rules out saying it exclusively to the person you're trying to reassure. Since the presence of an audience tends to reintroduce exactly the kind of persuasion this whole distinction has been trying to get away from. Sometimes repair, where repair is still possible, sometimes a change in conduct going forward, which seems to be the only kind of evidence a private ledger actually registers. And sometimes, when neither repair nor change is available anymore, something harder than either, accepting that an explanation, however honest, is not the same thing as absolution, and that some weight may simply have to be carried rather than resolved. That's not the same as saying suffering has to continue indefinitely as its own form of payment. Some consequences genuinely cannot be undone, even after honest acknowledgement or real changed conduct. That much the myth gets right. But carrying the knowledge of a consequence isn't the same as preserving punishment forever, and suffering doesn't automatically convert into repair just because it continues. At some point, it stops being moral seriousness and starts being its own kind of avoidance, the feeling that something is being done without anyone actually being helped by it. That last possibility tends to be the hardest one for a culture built on resolution to accept. There's a real appetite now for guilt to function like a debt with a payoff date, confess, repent, improve, and the ledger clears. Sometimes the weight does change after acknowledgement, repair, new information, or simply time. Sometimes it doesn't. Its persistence isn't proof that the original account was accurate, it's only proof that the question hasn't stopped being psychologically alive. None of this should be mistaken for evidence of an afterlife, and none of it should be mistaken for ancient Egyptians having anticipated modern psychology in disguise. The weighing of the heart is a myth, a culturally specific answer built from Egyptian theology and ritual practice to the question of what happens after death. It was never a clinical observation, and treating it as one would flatten exactly what makes it worth returning to. What makes it worth returning to isn't predictive accuracy. It's that the structure of the story, a self that can't simply argue its way past its own record, whether or not that record can always be trusted, happens to describe something people still feel in ordinary, undramatic moments long after the gods it was built around stopped being worshipped. You may never stand before Osiris, but you have, more than once, explained yourself convincingly to someone else and felt the explanation land somewhere your own heart declined to sign.